Well, hello there, friends. It's Tim Hanlon. You've come to the right place. It's Good Seats still available. And we're going to start the episode off with a little longish clip here, but you'll understand why on the other side. So at this moment, stand by for Paul Harvey news and comment.
Now, the rest of the story. Why do you suppose the uncivil war continues to intrigue us so? Could it be the irony of a nation calling itself the United States falling so bitterly into disunity? So passionate is this ongoing fascination that buffs find themselves in frequent disagreement. However, there seems to be a consensus that the war officially began April 12, 1861 at Fort Sumter. But who fired the first shot? It's been the subject of a lively debate among historians for more than 100 years. Most of the details regarding the assault on and defense of Fort Sumter were scrupulously recorded. But nobody remembers, that is, with certainty, the identity of the man who pulled the trigger and plunged the nation into its darkest hours. For many years, the distinction was bestowed upon one Edmund Ruthyn, a Virginia agriculturalist whose eagerness to have it out with the Yankees was indeed well known. Other names have been mentioned along the way, a lieutenant named Gibbs, a private named Halsey, even a little girl named Frances Pickens. Well, today's authorities say that probably Confederate Lieutenant S. Farley fired the opening shot of the Civil War. But pending the surprise discovery of some definitive document regarding the matter, all we can say for certain is that some Southerners started it. But this is the rest of the story. For all the uncertainty as to who shot first, there is no question whatsoever concerning who shot back. He was a senior captain of the Federal garrison defending Fort Sumter. He was, in fact, second in command, and his name was Abner. And you will recall that the fort was, in fact still is, located in Charleston Harbor, some distance from shore. The Yankees were in possession of the fort. The Rebs told the Yankees to get out. The Yankees said they would think about it, but they didn't think hard enough to suit the Rebs. At 4:30 a.m. on that fateful Friday, a Confederate artillery shell roared into the black sky from the ironclad battery on Morris Island. Now, Abner was asleep inside Fort Sumter. Abner was sound asleep until that Confederate shell crashed through the masonry and exploded not from the captain's head. Well, that rude awakening made Abner very angry. So, abruptly awakened, he managed to gather his wits about him, sought out and found the first Federal cannon within reach. As soon as he got his hands on that cannon, he returned the fire. And there's no doubt about what I've just said. For having fired the first Union shot of the Civil War, Abner nonetheless remains a mere footnote in the history of that conflict. You've never heard before that it was he who fired the first shot. Posterity has all but ignored what Abner did. Instead, Abner has been praised for something he never did. What he did not do was invent baseball. And yet he, Captain Abner Doubleday, in April of 1861, did indeed throw out the season's first Yankee cannonball. Now you know the rest of the story.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right. Settle down, everybody. How are you? It's Tim Hanlon, and it's Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. Thank you for finding us. Paul Harvey, good day. Yes, his little soliloquy there, a harbinger of what's to come in our conversation this week as we talk about some old-time baseball stuff with our guest, Jeff Orens, who's got a great new book out, highly encouraged reading and fascinating. It is called Selling Baseball, How Superstars George Wright and Albert Spalding Impacted Sports in America. Now, we were just talking about Abner Doubleday, however. What's that all about? Well, I encourage you to stay tuned into this conversation because the confluence between the two protagonists of of the story that Jeff Orens lays out are the two guys, George Wright and Albert Spalding, who were early pioneers in baseball, and their stories conjoin on a number of different occasions, both on the field and ultimately off the field. And Abner Doubleday makes an appearance near the end of this conversation that will sort of put everything into context. And I guess I'll sort of give you sort of a hint here. A lot of what we talk about in this upcoming conversation is sort of emblematic of the early days of baseball and the maturation of such. And in essence, the personification of that, as George Wright and Albert Spalding both simultaneously and in somewhat parallel fashion become star players in the early days of the game, both in the late amateur and early professional days of this fledgling sport. And both simultaneously and in parallel with each other, and occasionally crossing lines once in a while, recognizing that during their playing and thereafter, that a real sport full of potential commerce opportunities and the picks and shovels, if you will, of bats and balls and gloves and all kinds of other equipment and stuff that are going to be necessary for this now, whatever this professional sports thing is all about, as baseball was teaching everybody in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So a lot of this story is this sort of evolution of the careers of both Messrs. Wright and Spalding. And of course, Spalding Sporting Goods, as you well know, is a brand name that continues to live on today and plays an important part of this discussion. But as you'll hear, George Wright, when he was helping create and partner with his friends to create some sporting goods stuff, ultimately sold their efforts to Mr. Spalding, who, as you'll hear, was quite the, I don't know, maybe the P.T. Barnum of the time, so to speak, and that might be either being a little too charitable or maybe not so much. He was quite a showman, Mr. Spalding was, and certainly wasn't afraid of trying to create narratives and maybe embellishing the truth, so to speak, about what was really happening with this game of baseball. And in will ultimately step in the story of Abner Doubleday. And I'll just sort of leave it at that because the story of Abner Doubleday is very much part of the fabric of baseball's understood history, shall we say. Is it the accurate history of the origin of the game? Stay tuned. You'll find out and maybe have some thoughts about that as we get into our fascinating conversation with Jeff Orens. Again, he, the author of the excellent new book, and really, it made me think differently about the sport of baseball as we go back into some of the earliest days in its evolution. And again, that book is called Selling Baseball: How Superstars George Wright and Albert Spalding Impacted Sports in America. It is available, I believe, now wherever good books are found. It is published by our friends at Rowman and Littlefield. And of course, if you'd like to support this little show in a very small but very recognizable way, we'd appreciate it if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Search up this episode number, 800. Can you believe it? 381. There you go. Let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Episode 381 with Jeff Orens and me. And you'll find a couple of convenient links that will take you to Amazon. And we'll get a couple of referral shekels of love. We appreciate that. And you'll get the book in Kindle fashion format or a hardcover perhaps as fast as you can humanly get it. So we appreciate that consideration. And we also appreciate your consideration of this fine chat that we had with Jeff about, 5 days ago. It's fresh, spanking brand new. And I hope you enjoy it. I learned a lot, and I think and hope you will too. Please, as always, enjoy. Now, we've kind of nibbled around the edges of the earliest days of baseball, but I found it fascinating that you devote a book to this sort of selling proposition of baseball. But before we go any further, why don't you give our audience a little bit of a sense of who you are and what your relation and or interest in this topic to compel you to write this book, all that came from. Is it even related to your real life?
It's tangential to my real life, but I've had a strong connection with baseball personally since I was a young boy, but it wasn't because of who I knew or people that I had met in the sports world, that type of thing. My father gave me a book when I was 9 years old, and the book was called The Glory of Their Times by Lawrence Ritter.
Oh, sure, of course. That's a seminal
it's a classic. It is. And it's a book that when you read the subtitle talks about, the story of early baseball told by the men who played it, that sort of thing. And it's an interview of 25 guys. Lawrence Ritter went out and with a large tape recorder in the early 1960s, and he tracked down 25 of these guys who played baseball. And the earliest date that's listed in the book related to the guys playing the sport that he interviewed, each one was their career. It's Tommy Leach and it's Sam Crawford and those types of guys. The earliest date was, I believe, 1898 or 1899. So you sort of have a feeling from the time you start to read through this that baseball sort of sprung up, fully formed at 1900, right? And there was Babe Ruth, there was Ty Cobb, and Smokey Joe Wood, and all these guys, and that was baseball. And so for years, I had no idea that baseball didn't start at 1900 or 1898 or even close. I found through discussing with people and seeing what was out there, and then finally writing an article for a history magazine about the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings, the only undefeated team in baseball, right? I found out that baseball was being played in the 1830s and 1840s, and it wasn't even professional until the Cincinnati Red Stockings in 69 formed the first professional team. But there was no professional league until 1871. And, I got a whole different view of baseball and what baseball meant to the country, to America, in its formative stages, and how different groups of people embraced it, and different groups of people tried to understand, how do you play baseball? And what is it to be a good player? And how do I get to be good playing baseball? And those types of things. And then, well, what equipment do I need to play baseball? And what equipment might be developed that could protect me in a baseball game where my nose might be broken if I'm not wearing a catcher's mask or something along those lines? So I dug deeper as I wrote this story. It was about 6 years ago for a history magazine. And I found that George Wright was just such a tremendous ball player. And I thought, whoever heard of George Wright? Not in the glory of their times. George Wright wasn't mentioned once. I found that George Wright crossed paths with a guy who I sort of vaguely knew. His name was Albert Spalding, but I didn't know him as a baseball player. I knew Spalding and Brothers, the sporting equipment company. And I knew, there's a story here somewhere with these two guys crossing paths on a continual basis throughout the formative years of baseball, the 1860s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And long before we knew baseball as the professional sport it's become in the 1900s, and all the fun things about it, and all the not so fun things as well, but a combination of the good and the bad is always out there. Long before we knew baseball, there was baseball in one form or another. And it was fascinating for me to dig deeper into that and understand it. So that's sort of why I went down this path. And once I did, I got to tell you, I'm so glad I did. I was not a member of the Society for American Baseball Research, SABR, but I became one in the process. And I met a whole number of people who focused on different aspects of baseball. And of course, mine was 19th century baseball. And SABR has a 19th century research committee. And it's not 5 guys, it's 500 guys who in their own way either research or write or look into this whole aspect of baseball. 500 guys out of SABR has 7,000 members across the country. Baseball's a big business and it has a huge following. And people say, baseball, it's slow, it's going to lose ground to football and soccer and you name it. And maybe it will. So maybe that means the tens of millions of fans will shrink from 50 million to 40 million. I don't know. There's a huge group out there that loves baseball. Men, women, you name it. There are people who, they don't live and die by baseball, but it's pretty close. My best baseball buddy is my daughter, Rebecca. We are diehard Yankee fans. And I've got a limited season ticket. I bring her, I bring my friends, and being at a ballpark is just such a great experience. Being there in person, cheering these guys on, and pushing them to their extremes by us rooting for them. I mean, it's a fascinating combination of us and them trying to bond in a way that's I think only sports fans can realize how it works, right?
Well, look, I think a lot of this is very interesting because these two guys that you focus on, Messrs. Wright and Spalding, right? Not only were players in those earliest of years, mostly the 1870s, there's some overlap there. But they were, they were also sort of emblematic, I guess, of sort of the the sort of the rough and tumble pre-professional days, if you will, or budding professional realm of the game. So much so it was called space ball, right? Not baseball, right?
Right.
Yes. And I think the heart of the story, right, is not only were these guys, representative in their own way on the field, and they've had some decent stats and all that kind of stuff, and representative of all those stories and the intrigue about how players came and went and the skullduggery and the machinations of creating new leagues and not telling people and the reserve clause embedded in all of that kind of stuff, the drinking and the different leagues and their approaches to beer and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
But also, right, I think at the heart of this story is you set these guys up as being almost the foundational transition point from the sport to much more focused on professionalism, whatever that is, and the commerce aspects of that are needed to make it an enterprise per se versus just a rough and tumble, I don't know, sport, right?
Absolutely. Right. And that point is extremely important. When you choose the title Selling Baseball, what does it really mean, right? What it's talking about is not only these guys and their performance on the field, which was, as you mentioned, stellar. I mean, they were the best. They were the first professional superstars in the sport of baseball. But professionalism in and of itself was something that was so radical for baseball in the late 1860s. Baseball was put together as sort of a gentlemanly type of sport where exercise could be obtained, store clerks and merchants and salesmen. And when they could, they got together and they played the sport, and they didn't play it for anything but camaraderie and exercise. And as time went on, it became something that was more than just that. It was, well, we're better than you are as a one team versus another in a certain locale, or maybe as a shipbuilder's team versus a merchant's team, and different work groups playing against each other. And then the idea of, well, we want to be better than the other teams because we want the bragging rights to be the best in baseball. How are we going to do that? You know, well, one way to do it is to bring the best people that you can find to your team. And monetary inducement's always a great way to do that, right? So the idea of, well, let's pay some people. Since it's an amateur sport, the sport's first organizational body was the National Association of Baseball Players in 1858, put together with a number of teams in the Northeast. And the idea was amateurism was the guiding principle. We're all amateurs here. We're playing because we love the game. And that slowly turned into, well, we need some star players in order to beat the other team because we want to claim bragging rights to this little area of New York City, or New York City versus Philadelphia, or Philadelphia versus Chicago. And so to do that, we need the best, and we're willing to pay them. We'll pay them under the table, so we'll still call ourselves amateurs. But the idea of first payment in maybe, hey, here's a free meal. Here's some drinks at the end of the game. You know, we'll cover that for you. And then it was, well, how about a job? We'll give you a job, but we're really not paying you for that job. We're paying you to play baseball. You don't have to do the job. Just show up and be the star that you are in this game, and we'll be more than happy to pay you like someone who should be paid. By 1869, the situation was bubbling to in a cauldron that if you didn't address it, no one knew how baseball was going to go forward. And the National Association of Baseball Players finally said, we've got to allow professionalism. So what we're going to do is we'll continue the way we're playing, but you don't have to hide that you're professionals. In fact, if you want to be an all-professional team, pay your players openly. The only people who took them up on that in 1869 were Harry Wright and his brother George and the Cincinnati Red Stockings. And they proudly proclaimed, you know, we're an all-professional team. We pay all our players, and let's see what happens related to the product that we give out in the marketplace. And of course, an undefeated season ensued. And people started to say in corners of the baseball world, gee, maybe that's not such a bad idea. Maybe we should pay all of our players. By 1871, the National Association for Baseball Players was on its way out. And in its place was the National Association of Professional Baseball Players. Everyone openly paid their players, and they formed a league to play each other for bragging rights in the sport. So there were teams from Washington, D.C., and New York, and Philadelphia, and Chicago. By the way, Chicago was the pioneering Western outpost, because that's as far as you could take a train to get out to play someone, right? So you didn't go any further. You could, if you wanted to, spend 4 or 5 days getting out to the West Coast. The Cincinnati Red Stockings proved they could do that in 1869 when they played some exhibition games out there. But really, the world of baseball was sort of a Washington, D.C., up to Boston, out to Chicago type of area. Professional ball clubs playing each other for the bragging rights of the National Association of Professional Baseball Players. That's a long name. They just called themselves the NA, National Association. Everyone was professional. And as you bring professionalism in to the fore, there are some things that concern you related to, well, do the players act professionally? Are they constantly drinking? Is that something we'd like to show as the face of baseball to people who are paying a dime or a quarter or maybe even 50 cents to come and watch us? Gambling is pervasive in any sport. People always want to bet on the outcome, who's going to win, which team. But gambling that goes underground, players who throw games in order to have a payout at the end of the day, we've got to control that somehow. And the National Association was really poor at doing that. They couldn't bring themselves, as a National Association of baseball players, they couldn't bring themselves to regulate themselves. And Spalding was really key to deciding himself, I don't want to play in an environment like this. I'm great at it. In fact, he was the best pitcher in baseball from 1871 to 1875, which was the short lifespan of the National Association. But even being on top of the world in that league, he said, this really isn't the way things should run. And he searched for a way to move forward. And he found that with a moneyed individual out in Chicago, a guy named William Hulbert, who loved his Chicago White Stockings. And he induced Spalding and a number of Boston Red Stockings to go west and form the National League. The National League was dedicated to cleaning up the sport. We've been trying to clean up the sport since, right?
Yeah, no more beer and whiskey, right? Or at least a little less so.
But the idea was still there. We'd like to regulate what happens here. But the key to the National League was they decided we've got to separate the way the sports run in terms of there needs to be part of an organization, of a club, that takes care of the management of it, all the administrative work, all the logistics. And then there's got to be the other portion, which is the players and the manager. They take care of what's the product. The product is performance out on the field. So let's divide that up. Seemed like it made a lot of sense. The problem was, once you move all the administrative work under a separate umbrella, then the administrators try to get an uneven economic situation going. They don't want to pay the players exactly what they're worth. They'll pay them a little bit less, but they'll keep them continuing to play for them. And by the early 1880s, the way they did that was develop the reserve clause. We're going to put people on a list. The owners colluded and said, we're going to put people on a list for each team. And the top 5 players are on, let's say, the Boston Red Stockings list. And the Chicago White Stockings have a list. And the Philadelphia Athletics have a list. And we agree that we won't touch those players who are on a competing team. And as soon as you agree to collude like that, what happens is those players don't get paid what they're worth anymore. It used to be a situation where they could go out and at the end of the season offer their services to anyone. And the owners were terrified of that. My God, what's that going to mean? I'm going to have to bid against someone else, and the price of these guys is going to go crazy. We've got to clamp down on that. And in its nascent organization, the baseball owners said, we've got to do that right now. We can't wait for years and years to go by. And so, as you described, there's a growing professional system that also is trying to work its way through a myriad of economic problems that there are no solutions to at this point in time, no clear solutions. And the best way that the owners could figure was, we've got a solution. We'll just collude and make it impossible for ball players to get what they're worth. How long did it take to break the reserve clause? I think the late 60s, early 70s.
Sure.
100 years.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, these two guys, right? Wright and Spalding, and maybe I'll ask you to kind of give us a little thumbnail of each of them, but
sure.
And then we'll sort of bring their collective stories together. These guys are both representative of what you just described, right? These are early players in this National Association of baseball players. uh,
Right.
and were there, if you will, at the creation, if you will, of the National League, at that gear shift into the professional thing, at least in its
Yes.
early days, right?
Right.
And both
Right.
were standouts in their own way. Um, Spalding was a great pitcher, and Wright was a shortstop who, um, I think his career batting average over his 11 or 12 seasons or so was 301, and was
Yes.
arguably one of the best, if not maybe, well, arguably one of the best players of his generation overall, right? So these
Yes.
guys
Oh,
are
absolutely.
representative in their own ways of what you just described, sort of writ large. How about a little sort of thumbnail about each of these two? Because embedded in their careers, right, is as your book sort of describes it, maybe you can kind of hint at almost some of the seeds of I guess in a modern day terminology, entrepreneurialism, in terms
Sure.
of seeing opportunities for this thing called baseball to become something more than just guys playing by rules now all of a sudden.
Absolutely. You bring up some good points. Let me take a step back and walk through a quick look at George Wright and Albert Spalding from a baseball player standpoint first. So George Wright was basically, everyone knows a guy like George Wright, a natural athlete in whatever he did. He picked up a ball and bat, and he was the best at what he did. Was it cricket? Yes. Cricket was the first sport that he played. His father was a professional cricket player and manager of a team in New York City and then in New Jersey. And he himself, the father, was a great cricket player, and he taught his boys, he had four of them, taught them how to play cricket. And they learned how to play cricket in the 1850s when baseball was forming, and it hadn't formed with all the rigor that it did in the coming years, but they learned then how to play baseball after cricket. Once they learned how to play baseball, the boys decided, especially Harry, who was 12 years older than George and Harry decided that baseball was their game. They enjoyed it because it was fast paced. You could play a game in 2 or 3 hours. Cricket might take a day, could take 2 days. Some cricket matches would be shorter, most wouldn't be. All sorts of etiquette in cricket related to how you bat, how you pitch, how you field, those types of things. And in England, that was the point of cricket: exercise and decorum, everything done in a certain way. Baseball was hustle and bustle, and things happened. Every play was going to change the game, and it was all over in 2 or 3 hours. They loved that. The Wright brothers, Harry and George, couldn't get enough of it. Harry, 12 years older than George, was a good ball player, solid and recognized as such in the Northeast where he played. He played in the New York area and then moved with his family down to New Jersey. That's where George was, and George's father, their father, and their family. And he was recognized as a good ball player, but what he really was recognized for, Harry, as someone who could bring together individual talent to form a team that would work together and win. There's a novel idea: teamwork, how to construct a team, how to practice with a team, to anticipate situations in a game. All those things Harry brought to the fore. Harry was a planner and could see ahead. He had a vision for how baseball should function as a sport. George, he was the preeminent baseball athlete of the 1860s. He would every year invariably be the best player, maybe in the top five, but usually the best player, recognized as such. And each year he would move to another team for an under the table inducement, right? The idea of, yeah, I play amateur baseball, but really someone's going to buy my services so that I can help them win a championship, was the way George worked. George knew that he could count on his superior athletic skills to go wherever he might be needed. He was single. The idea of going to, remember, baseball was in a small geography, and staying in the Northeast, he could go from New York to Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., and play for all those teams. And he did. He played for the New York Gothams. He played for the Unions of Morrisania, which is used to be part of the Bronx way back when. He played for Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Olympics. He played for the Washington Nationals. He was a hired gun you'd bring in if you wanted a championship. We all know how that works. And George was just the right guy to do it. He had great temperament. He was always cheerful, smiling. You ask for effort, he gives you 110%. And it's not a real effort for him. It's his love of the game coming out in every play. He was a great fielder. He played shortstop and really took that position and made it his own. He did things that defined what a shortstop would be in the future. And it's because he had such great physical ability, he could do that. He was ambidextrous. He was accurate throwing with either hand. He had speed. He was agile. He could play back up on the infield, right up to the outfield grass. And that was unusual. Most infielders played very close to the base that they were assigned. George could cover tremendous amounts of ground, grab a ball, turn, and throw it to first base with pinpoint accuracy. That's the kind of shortstop you want. He was there. On the flip side, many guys who are great fielders don't hit that well. George was a supreme batsman. He could hit for power. He could deftly place a ball. He could bunt. He could do anything that the game required at a particular moment. And once he got on base, he had blazing speed. The guy wasn't unstoppable, but he was close to it. He would move, and the game would move as he did. If he was moving around those bases, you have to watch out because he's going to score. So George Wright was the type of guy who really took advantage of what baseball had to offer minute by minute or season by season. It was, who's going to want my services and where do I have to go to make that happen? I'm willing to do that. But at the same time, he also started to think about supplying the sport with the implements it needed to play the game, because the sport was becoming now organized and proliferating in terms of the number of teams that were out there. And he saw right away that, wow, we need more bats, we need more balls, we need more bases, we need more uniforms. And who's going to supply all that? Well, it turns out George's family, in addition to being great cricket players in the 1850s, George's father was already involved in sporting goods on a very rudimentary level for cricket. Harry picked up on that in the early 1860s, and George followed in the late 1860s. And George actually went into business with his brother Harry in 1868 to form the first George Wright, Harry Wright combination of sporting goods offerings. What better person to buy baseball implements from than the guy who was the best, recognized best in the business? So he started in 1868 with that, and he had a two-pronged effort. He didn't put a lot of time and effort into sporting goods at that point, but he knew that that was something that could outlast a baseball career. So he was smart enough to see that. Spalding, on the other hand, was a guy who grew into baseball from a career standpoint. When I say grew into baseball, physically as well as emotionally, he did. He was a sort of a loner in the 1860s, out on the prairie in rural Illinois, outside of Chicago by about 90 miles west. And he picked up baseball because he happened to run into a group of kids who were playing, and they saw him and asked him to join. And he suddenly found he had a real ability to throw the ball accurately as a pitcher. The thing about Spalding was he grew to be 6 feet 1 inches tall, which is pretty imposing back in the 1860s when the average height was about 5'8", 5'9". You're imposing. You can also, at that size, generate a fair amount of speed pitching the ball. And pitching the ball was done underhand only. That was the rule that was brought into place in the 1860s because the game had been codified according to a type of baseball that only allowed underhand pitching. Albert was great at it. He could throw fast. He could throw in a changeup. He could pinpoint where the ball was going. And he was throwing from 45 feet away from the batter, not 60 feet 6 inches, as they do today, and as they've done for many, many years. Imagine an underhand softball pitcher, 45 feet away. Remember Eddie Feiner and softball? He could throw a ball by you before you could even see it. Spalding was that type of pitcher. He was extremely accurate, and he was extremely fast when he wanted to be. And he'd throw in a changeup every once in a while just to keep you on your toes. He had ability, and he used that ability to attract the attention of Harry and George Wright. He played for a team out in the Midwest, as I said, southwest of Chicago. It's called the Forest Citys of Rockford, Illinois. Forest City, you get an idea. I mean, there's forest everywhere, right? This was a rural area where he grew up. Well, the Forest Citys ended up becoming the Midwestern rival of the Cincinnati Red Stockings in 1869 and 1870. And Albert faced George 4 times in each of those 2 seasons. And every time the Red Stockings beat him until the last game that they played in 1870, where something finally clicked with Albert in terms of how to not let the domination of Cincinnati get into his head. Not physically. He knew he could compete physically, but he just had a hurdle to overcome. And in that last game he did. He pitched a 6-hitter, which in 1870 was almost like a no-hitter. To hold a team to 6 hits was just amazing. Now, it turned out 4 of those 6 were home runs by the Cincinnati team, and George and Harry hit 1 apiece, but the Forest Citys scored 12 runs, and Cincinnati was only able to score 5. So breaking through there, that attracted Harry and George Wright's attention immediately. They had seen over the past couple of years how Albert was becoming a better and better pitcher. When in 1871, the first professional league formed, it really formed around Harry and George going to Boston from Cincinnati. The Cincinnati team folded because they had lost a handful of games, and the Cincinnati faithful weren't willing to support them anymore. Imagine, they didn't go undefeated. They lost 6 games and won 71. That type of thing was commonplace, teams coming and going. But Harry and George were enticed to come to Boston to form a new team, and the team was the Boston Red Stockings. They took the Cincinnati Red Stockings name with them. The Red Stockings brought it to Boston and retooled as the Boston Red Stockings. Harry and George saying, the pitcher we have to have is Albert Spalding. He's the guy who has the capability, both physically and now mentally, to overcome almost anything in a league game situation. They formed the first great dynasty of the professional baseball league. And that basically was the Boston Red Stockings, who won 4 championships in the 5 years of the National Association's existence. And each year, they were better than the year before, up until 1875, when they won 71 games out of 81 games. And they did it with superlative pitching, Spalding, superlative fielding and hitting, George Wright, and superlative management, Harry Wright. Those three together were almost an unbreakable situation. People used to joke in 1875 that this was Harry Wright's league. He'll let you know if he wants you to win or not. Of course, Harry Wright was scrupulously honest. He would never throw a game, but he had such a good team with George and Albert and a whole host of others who were supporting that it was almost inevitable that these guys were going to win a game. So here you're talking about guys who were superlative in what they did athletically. Albert growing into his situation and George just always being the super athlete that was recognized. Many people called him the king of baseball, and they weren't far off. So these guys had a lot going for them. Albert saw that Harry and George were looking at selling equipment as well as performing. And he had decided early on, even before he was brought into the fold in Boston, that was something he wanted to do too. He didn't know how yet, but that was on his mind as well.
All right, what's this? Oldschoolshirts.com. Fantastic. You've heard me talk on and on and on about the great folks and the great wares at oldschoolshirts.com. Like the name implies, it's old school and it's shirts, and they put them together, into what they call oldschoolshirts.com. It's like the name implies, but of course we love them primarily for their sports wear. You name the league of the past, you name the team of the past, the chances are huge that they're going to have more than one shirt and different color schemes for things that you may remember from the United Football League or the Major Indoor Soccer League or various flavors of the original XFLs, plural, or the Federal League perhaps, or maybe World Team Tennis, or maybe it was the North American Soccer League, and on and on and on. But hey, it's not just sports. It's also great cultural touchstones and memories from the past. How about the officially licensed Evel Knievel connection? How about collection? Yeah, that's what he's trying to say. Various colleges. How about dead malls of the past? Ice cream parlors, maybe even radio stations that you might remember. Hey, even there's a latest edition of the now old, Aloha Stadium commemorative shirt. All that kind of stuff and more. You will find at least a handful of shirts that you will just transport you back into your past, and you will amaze and impress your friends at the same time. It's oldschoolshirts.com, and we got a promo code for you, of course. Let's save you some dough while you go there, and its promo code is Good Seats. Good Seats. That's the promo code at oldschoolshirts.com. Promo code Good Seats for 10% off all of your purchases. Hey, P.F. Wilson and your friends at oldschoolshirts.com, thank you for your sponsorship of the show. And now, back to our conversation. Spalding was also pioneering the use of gloves, right, during his play?
Well, not quite at that point. What happened was, you're right. He basically, in 1876, when he left Boston, and he left Boston because he was at the top of the world there, and he saw that there was no other place for him to go but to go to a new team. Think of Juan Soto and the New York Yankees today. Juan Soto could have been the king of the Yankees, except it's Aaron Judge's team. Aaron Judge loves playing with Juan Soto, but Soto knew he had to go someplace else in order to make his own mark. And that's what Spalding knew. He knew that he could always play and be a superlative pitcher, but he had to go someplace else. And when he went to Chicago and the National League was formed, He pitched that first year in 1876 and won 47 games. He was the best pitcher in the new National League. But that year, many of those who were experimenting with the curveball started to throw it with more regularity. And by the end of the season, people were clamoring for Spalding to be a curveball pitcher, just like so many were becoming. Candy Cummings had pioneered the curveball in the late 1860s, early 1870s, and he actually tried to teach Spalding how to throw it. Spalding couldn't master it. And he knew as much, and he knew his pitching days were over. He played in 1876, and he actually led the Chicago White Stockings to a title. But by 1877, he was no longer pitching. He was also the manager of the team in 1876. That was part of his deal, player manager, when he came out to Chicago. And he decided to take himself out of the role of pitching because curveball pitching was becoming the thing. You had to be or have a curveball pitcher in your arsenal. And those were the days where you only had one or two pitchers on the team. He took himself out. He played first base and second base, and he did well. He was a good hitter. He'd always been athletic. He was a good hitter, but he knew that he couldn't throw the curveball anymore, and that was the end of his pitching days. But he also knew that he didn't want to play first base and keep catching the ball and bruising his hand. It was a constant struggle. When he was a pitcher, what happens? You get the ball thrown back to you every pitch, right? And he knew his hand was suffering. He decided in 1877 that what he was going to do was wear a glove. Oh my God, how unmanly. I mean, what a wimp, right? He's going to wear a baseball glove. But he was such a hero in the baseball world that he decided he wouldn't wear a baseball glove that some people had experimented with, a flesh-colored glove, so you really couldn't see what was on your hand if you were sitting in the stands. He wore a jet black baseball glove. Why? To popularize baseball gloves, because this was the first year, 1876, 1877, that he actually had started his own sporting goods business with his brother Walter. And he said, we got to get gloves. Can you imagine how many people are going to want baseball gloves if I popularize a glove? So it was an evolution that had to take place as far as Spalding was concerned, not only for his hand, but for his business. He knew that this would be a whole new area that no one had ever explored from a sports equipment standpoint, and he made it his own. Can you imagine? When you go to play baseball today, or at any time between then and now, someone would always have a baseball that they could bring, and some guys would bring bats to a game and a pickup game, but everyone wanted their own glove, right? You want your glove. You want to break it in yourself. You want to make it your own. He popularized that. There were a few people who wore gloves in the late 1860s. The catcher for the Cincinnati Red Stockings actually wore some gloves for a short time period. There were a couple other people in the early 1870s, but Spalding was the guy who popularized it. And that was the first protective piece of equipment. And he looked at it as protective. It was protecting his hand, which was suffering so much punishment on a continual basis. When you're at first base and everyone's throwing the ball to you, it's not like being a pitcher, but your hand's going to get pretty beat up. And he decided that was the time to do it. The guy who popularized the other protective piece of equipment, the catching mask, was George Wright. At the time that Spalding was pushing gloves as a sign of the time to come, in college baseball, 1877, a guy named Fred Thayer, who was captain of the Harvard University baseball team, invented the catcher's mask. And George was playing in Boston, so he was right there and he could see it. And he saw the potential for the catcher's mask. The reason he saw the potential was 10 years before, he had been fooling around with something called a catcher's mouth guard. sort of a tooth guard or a protective rubber plate that you'd put in your mouth, and it would push against the teeth and keep them in one place if you so happen to be hit with a ball. Catchers being hit with a ball, commonplace, fastball that you can't handle, a foul tip that comes screaming off the bat and hits you in the nose and breaks your nose. The catchers were subject to continual physical abuse by playing baseball. And George at least wanted to protect their teeth and their mouth. And he also wanted to do it for himself because he would wear during the game the same catcher's mouth guard in his own mouth. The reason he did was because he was known as Smiling George. One of his big characteristics that people loved was his gleaming smile. He was like the Teddy Roosevelt picture that you see where it's all teeth, as Teddy's smiling to the crowd in a photograph. George was the same way, and he wanted to protect that feature. So he wore this protective mouth guard. No one could see it. You weren't called, a wimp for wearing it, and catchers used to pop it in their mouths as well. It didn't work like a catcher's mask, but by 1877, Fred Thayer invented this. George saw it up close and personal because they were in Boston, and he convinced Thayer to do two things. First, patent the piece of equipment, and that was important. And secondly, allow him, George Wright, to pay Thayer a royalty to be the exclusive seller of the catcher's mask into the marketplace. What a great combination, right? Someone's invented it. He's going to get a royalty for it. Someone is going to take advantage of that and, with the sporting goods business, sell it both professionally and to amateurs as well. And it was a great thing that started to happen. But what George didn't anticipate was Spalding and others in the equipment business, they weren't going to let a patent get in the way. They started selling catcher's masks as quick as they could. And Wright really didn't know what to do with it until Fred Thayer graduated from Harvard undergrad and went and got a law degree. He got a law degree, and he came back to George and he said, "We've got a patent here. We've got to defend it, and I'll defend it as a lawyer." And they went to court. From 1883, they filed a patent suit that was approved in their favor in 1886. And Spalding and his sporting goods company and others owed them money for the sales that they made violating Thayer's patent. So it was a great situation for George and for Thayer. They made a lot of money off of it. But that was the type of thing that was going on back in the 1870s and 1880s. There were no rules that were really being laid out as a clear way to go forward. Every step of the way was inventive, trying to understand what might work. And George and Albert were great at picking up on what opportunities are out there and how can I, if I'm no longer playing, how can I still benefit by what's happening? Now,
yeah, so in the 80s, these guys are basically in parallel paths in the picks and shovels business, right?
Absolutely.
As the thing's becoming a sport. Tell me how they literally come together by the end of the decade, because they actually do become business partners, if you will, or there's actually a consummation of a deal between these two. And by the way, are these the two major purveyors, so to speak, of sporting goods at the time, or is there a cottage industry of others as well at this time?
That's a good point. Certainly there is a cottage industry in that even in the 1860s, right? People wanted baseballs, they wanted bats, they wanted bases, and started to want uniforms. Remember, the Cincinnati Red Stockings popularized the use of stockings and a knickered short, which revolutionized the sporting clothing being worn in baseball. Everyone used to wear workman's long pants and a cap. As a cricket player, that's what you'd wear. And that was the first pseudo uniform that baseball players wore until this specialized uniform was put in place in 1869. But the idea here was both Albert and George were becoming very successful as sports equipment purveyors. There were a couple other sporting goods operations that were rather large, one called Peck and Snyder in New York City that predated both of them in the mid-1860s and was ostensibly the biggest American provider of sporting goods at that time. There was another baseball player in the mid-60s who went into the sporting goods business, and he became very successful at it. He was the second baseman for the Philadelphia Athletics. His name was Al Reach. And by the early to mid-70s, he had retired and gone into sporting goods full-time. The way they succeeded was the way each of them succeeded was by carving out their own niche, if you will, that wasn't necessarily head-on competitive. Spalding, because he helped found the National League with William Hulbert, the head of the Chicago White Stockings, who became president of the National League. Because Spalding helped found the National League, Hulbert gave some business to Spalding, like all the baseballs for the National League we're going to buy from Spalding. That's a pretty good chunk of business. Spalding asked to provide an annual compendium of statistics on the year before. They called it the Official League Guide. And it was great because people were hungry to see who was doing what statistically. George Wright, how did he bat that year? How did Albert Spalding pitch? And how did they compare with the others? This was a great next step for Spalding, but Spalding did something even better. What he did was he unofficially named a compendium that sort of went hand in hand with the official league book. He called it the Official Baseball Guide. It wasn't official. No one had approved it. But since he was already selling the official league book, he claimed that title and no one did anything about it. And as the Official Baseball Guide, what Spalding did was he not only gave statistics and showed how people performed individually in his teams, he gave tips on baseball. He had a star pitcher write about how do you throw a curveball. He'd have the leading batters write about how are you successful in bunting and that type of thing. People who are base stealers, let's talk about base running. He crammed his guide, Official Baseball Guide, with those types of tidbits. And you can imagine people who are just learning how to play baseball. Suppose you come over from Lithuania and you're here and you want to fit in to American culture. And you see they're playing this game. How do I play that game? Well, you can read about it in this Official Baseball Guide, or maybe have someone who knows English teach you how to do it as you're learning English because you've just come over here. But the overriding impetus was for immigrants, especially, to show their civic pride and their pride in America by playing the sport that was the game that Americans played. And so the Official Baseball Guide could almost double as, how to learn English and how to play sports in America. And you would read that and you'd understand more about it as best you could. And you'd try what they said in there. So that was an area that Spalding excelled at, getting the National League to support him. Well, what did these other guys do? I mean, they weren't going to take the business from Spalding. He was hand in glove with William Hulbert. So they looked for other opportunities as well as sports, as well as baseball as a sport. So, yeah, they'd provide baseball. George Wright was very good. at supplying baseball sporting goods to collegiate associations and commercial groups that got together. Al Reach did the same type of thing, but Al Reach was also into an area that neither of the other two was, and that was gymnasium equipment, Indian clubs that you'd use to throw up and down and stretch your muscles and those types of things. A trapeze and rowing machines and things that basically weren't in the baseball world, but were useful for exercise, and people wanted those things. And in the 1860s and 1870s, there were people who had some disposable income to actually spend on that type of paraphernalia. He focused his work not only in baseball, because again, that he was the second baseman for the Philadelphia Athletics. I mean, he had an in there, but he also focused in some other areas that were non-baseball. And in the 1880s, baseball expanded itself. It went from 1881 being only one league, the National League. By 1884, there were three leagues. There was the American Association that developed in 1882, and then the Union Association in 1884. You can imagine the need for baseball equipment, right? So these guys were in baseball as their prime area. The National League was the senior league, and the American Association existed. It needed someone to put out its official league book. Al Reach stepped in. He took that as his particular area. The Union Association was a third league. George Wright became a partial owner of a Boston team in the Union Association, and they rewarded him by saying, why don't you put out our league book? Why don't you sell baseballs to us? And so baseball, yes, was the prime supporter, but the National League overwhelmed the other two leagues in terms of what was available. So George Wright looked at this and he said, well, there are other things we can do. And his partner, after George had moved to Boston, he went through a series of different places where he set up shop. And in 1879, he brought on a guy named Henry Ditson as his chief clerk in his Boston store. And by the end of 1879, he made Ditson his partner. And the name Wright and Ditson as a sporting goods equipment supplier became well known in the Northeast and then eventually across the country. And it lasted for a number of years. Ditson was very strong in supporting tennis and the development of tennis in the 1880s in the US, which was proliferating as it had come over from England, and people could see the opportunity for exercise and play in different areas of the country. California developed a tennis community that could play year-round. And so the idea of tennis as a sport became very exciting. The mid-'80s was a time when roller skating was a craze across the country, and a sport developed using roller skates and a roller rink, an indoor roller rink, and it was called roller polo. It was really the crude precursor to ice hockey. You were playing on roller skates and a roller rink with a rubber ball that bounced around, and there were six guys on a side, and they had a field hockey type of stick, and they were whacking at the ball, trying to get it into a goal at one end or the other. And you can imagine the mayhem. These guys roller skating at top speed, trying to get to a ball, stopping on a dime or not, ramming into each other, hitting each other with field hockey type sticks as they're trying to whack this ball. I mean, it was mayhem, and the crowds loved it. It was a sport that took roller skating to new heights. Roller skating was sort of it was a craze, but it was a sedate one. You'd bring your girlfriend to a roller rink and you'd skate around the rink, and that's lasted for a long, long time. But this added a dimension that was very visceral. You'd feel your heart jumping out of your chest as you're seeing these guys attack each other to try to get this ball to knock it in to a goal. And it was something that became very popular for about 10 years in the Northeast and the Midwest. And then slowly that evolved to ice hockey because you could play ice hockey outside and you could have an ice rink inside. So the idea there was if you were playing on a sheet of ice, you didn't want a rubber ball that bounced around. You'd never know where it would end up. You wanted a puck that would glide along the ice, and you wanted sticks that were longer and had a blade that could control the puck. And that game was much more exciting in that you knew there was going to be scoring with that game because there was more control with the hockey stick. Hockey evolved, became the sport that took over from roller polo, but roller polo lasted in some areas in the Midwest until the 1920s. And the key to George Wright and Harry Ditson was getting involved in the ground floor in a sport like roller polo, where you get involved in the associations that are supporting it and getting contracts for uniforms, balls, sticks, goal cages, anything that you could sell except roller skates. Roller skates were something that was a roller skate manufacturer's purview. Everything else was fair game for these other guys. And George Wright and others would resell someone's manufactured roller skate, but they weren't about to make that sort of stuff themselves.
Well, as we call
the story.
Yeah, as we cul-de-sac here, I want to get a sense of though these two guys came together though, right?
Yes, and I'm just about to get there.
Go ahead.
Because what happened was Henry Ditson, George's partner, dropped dead in 1891. After being his partner for a dozen years, he was 35 years old and he died. And George Wright was not Henry Ditson in terms of the organizational and bottom line man that Henry was. Henry ran the business and George was the outside salesman. George didn't really have a talent for running a business, nor did he want to. And when Henry Ditson dropped dead, he said, I'm getting out of this. And who wanted to buy that business but Albert Spalding? Spalding wanted to pick up all of these things that George Wright was doing and add it to his baseball empire. Spalding had also been involved in football. He'd been involved in basketball. Those types of things were starting to grow. But tennis was huge. Roller polo was big. George Wright even had brought over golfing equipment and started golf in the Northeast. He was known as the father of golf in Boston and the surrounding area. So this was a play by Spalding to consolidate his competition, right? In terms of the sporting goods business. He had already in 1889 bought Al Reach's business, his gymnasium business, his baseball business. He went out and he bought George Wright's business in 1892. And 2 years later, he bought Peck and Snyder, which had been the biggest sporting goods equipment seller in the 1860s and 70s. So in the space of less than 5 years, he wrapped up the major producers. But he did it in a really smart way. Spalding basically said to George, look, you'll remain as president. The business will still be called Wright and Ditson. I'll be your silent partner. I'll have a manager in place to run the business, so you don't have to worry about it, George. That's a big concern of yours. And basically, that presented to the marketplace the idea that there was still competition. Here's Wright and Ditson. No one knows that Spalding has bought 99% of it. They compete in the marketplace, yet they're friendly competitors, if you will. And this was good at that time because the Sherman Antitrust Act had just come into place, excuse me, in 1890. And it didn't start to really have teeth until Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901. At that time, monopolies were starting to be busted up by Roosevelt and the government. And Spalding and Wright and Ditson were not looked at as companies that were monopolizing the market. They were competitors, at least to the public. And so Spalding's planning there paid off. But Spalding owned Wright and Ditson after 1892, and he had George Wright and his sons be involved in the business, so that on the surface, this was a healthy competition. But certainly, Spalding benefited immensely by the combination of Wright and Ditson under his silent leadership.
So I think it's a very interesting sort of dynamic in that here are these guys that were at the earliest days of baseball. They were there at the creation, shall we say, of the professional game. The gear shift from amateurism into the beginnings of what professionalism were, and in their own entrepreneurial kind of ways, recognizing that there's gold and then there are gloves and bats as this thing became a more solidified sport with competition and teams and leagues, plural, and ultimately coming together, if you will, in their own sort of unique way for essentially a combined business. I guess I want to sort of end with, and there's a lot more in the book, of course, and then obviously we'll be touting it. You want to leave a little bit on the table here for people to actually go out and buy the book and read it.
Sure.
But I want to get to sort of one interesting little sort of, I think, thing that kind of ties a maybe nice bow on this conversation and perhaps in this story, but it's not maybe the way you did it, but there's another sort of overlap of their ambitions and or I don't know, selling baseball as your title implies or says.
Sure.
And that's this Abner Doubleday Mills Commission thing. Do you want to kind of describe that? Because it's really interesting. I mean, I think embedded in all of what you've described over the last hour or so is this narrative, right? This mythology, the story, right, of this baseball thing, right? And as the years pile on, right, history is tabulated, the stats are there, but there's also a narrative, a storyline of the sport that I want to say is up for grabs, but certainly in the formative years, right, is maybe subject to corralling and or underlining or steering, shall we say? And I was kind of amazed, some passing knowledge of this, but really amazed that both of these guys were very well. You tell the story. They were complicit, shall we say, in what came out of this commission.
It is an interesting story, and it's really based in Albert Spalding's desire, above all else, to claim baseball as an American sport, not only our national game, but from the soul of America and representative of America's characteristics that he felt were so important and that he felt he had developed by playing baseball: teamwork and determination and pride in a job well done. And he felt that it was important to say to the rest of the world, if not fellow Americans, this is our sport. This wasn't something that was derived from cricket. This was a sport, and the SABR researchers have proven that this is a sport that was an amalgamation of many bat and ball games of the time period. Baseball did not just spring out of nowhere. It certainly didn't spring out of the head of a 19-year-old Abner Doubleday in a field in 1839 in Cooperstown, New York, which is how the myth goes. So Abner Doubleday was really a lot of things to people from a patriotic standpoint. He was a general during the Civil War. He fought in a number of battles, for the Union, was wounded but escaped each time to fight again. And he was quite a hero of sorts. And Spalding latched onto him in an unusual way. Spalding put together what was called the Mills Commission in 1905. It was his idea to define once and for all that the sport of baseball was American and it wasn't British in origin. He had a playful, sometimes cantankerous relationship with a journalist named Henry Chadwick, who was through and through a baseball person, but he was English, transplanted Englishman who had come to America. And Chadwick used to say, baseball is just descended from a child's British game called rounders. And Spalding hated hearing that. And in Spalding's official baseball guide, he challenged Chadwick to prove that. And Spalding said, I'm going to put a commission together to put an end to that particular line of thinking. And so he advertised to the public, send me your information about baseball and its origins. By the way, on the commission, just to make sure things turned in his favor, on the commission, he stacked it heavily with his friends. George Wright was on the commission. Al Reach was on the commission. The head of two former heads of the National League were on the commission. Abraham Mills, the commission's named after him, was one of them. And these guys basically would end up rubber stamping Spalding's opinion. A letter came to Spalding's attention once information was requested of the public. It's from a guy named Abner Graves, who was in his 70s at the time when he wrote the letter. And Graves said, I remember back in 1839, a 19-year-old named Abner Doubleday was out in the back field of a farm here, and I was playing with him. I was a playmate at Doubleday's, and he scratched on the ground a diamond, and he told us what the rules were of a sport called baseball. And we played it, and it was great. And Spalding got this letter, and he was ecstatic. He got a copy of it from the newspaper that Graves had sent the letter to when information was requested. And all searching ended at that point for any other information on the origins of baseball. Spalding had what he wanted. He had Abner Doubleday, an American military hero, is the founder, inventor of baseball, an all-American sport. And, an origin myth like that is something that people who are not educated in the history of baseball could swallow very easily, hook, line, and sinker. And it was all part of Spalding's unique capabilities to promote and to get a message out, sort of like a P.T. Barnum type of individual who takes a kernel of truth and embellishes it a little bit. And here you have the fully formed origin of baseball from Abner Doubleday, a 19-year-old who did all this. Well, if he'd gone any further to explore Graves and his situation, he would have found that Graves, who claimed he was a playmate with Abner Doubleday, was 5 years old in 1839. Let's see, he was playing with the 19-year-old Abner Doubleday, the sport of baseball. Okay, questionable. Abner Doubleday never once in all of his years, he died in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I'm not sure exactly when, but he lived a long life. Never once did he speak of developing baseball. Did he write of developing baseball? Did he put in a journal that this happened because of him? There was no evidence from Abner Doubleday that he had anything to do with creating baseball. And really, he didn't. But by the time Spalding officially said, this is as far as we're going to go, and he had the Mills Commission put their rubber stamp on it, George Wright, Al Reach, Abraham Mills, all signed off on a letter that was put in Spalding's official baseball guide that said as much. People accepted it. You talk to someone today about where did baseball come from? I would venture to say that over half the people you talk to say, Abner Doubleday invented it, didn't he? They seem to remember something about that. And it's sort of like the glory of their times. Baseball started around 1900, didn't it? I mean, that's as far back as I know, and the glory of their times is a seminal text, and people who don't have any desire to look further than the surface can accept those things hook, line, and sinker, and that's what happened. And so it took until the 1970s, 80s, 90s for researchers to discount that myth, that origin myth of Abner Doubleday. By then, it had been in the American psyche for, 1907 until 1970. Let's call it 65 years. It's tough to dislodge that sort of memory, especially when it's a real sweet one related to an American war hero who develops an American game in Cooperstown. And the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown spent a number of years not denying the myth, but certainly not trying to dissuade anyone that Abner Doubleday didn't invent or invented baseball. They went along with that, and it was done in Cooperstown, right? So it's a confluence of particular thoughts that Spalding worked very diligently to place into the American culture, and he was quite successful doing it. And George Wright was more than happy to support Spalding's particular thoughts there. But really, when you come right down to it, most Americans didn't care. What they cared about was playing the game, following the game, understanding its rules, how to play it, because when you did, you were American. You showed yourself to your fellow countrymen as being supportive of something that was our national game, and the pride that people have in supporting baseball is one of the reasons I believe it's going to live for a long, long time. People enjoy that type of relationship with civics, patriotism, country, and playing a sport that's fun. A combination of all those things didn't really matter. Is it Abner Doubleday? Who is it? Is it anyone? Is it an amalgamation of different games of ball and bat? We'll accept that. What we want to do is play the game. And that's really the bottom line for George Wright, for Spalding, and for those who were selling baseball to the American public. We want you to be part of the whole. And I think that's the story behind it.
Interesting having this conversation at this time, right? Because I would argue
Yes.
a lot of people are soul searching about sort of the idea of America as things get torn apart from different political perspectives and approaches to government and running the country and all that kind of stuff. And yet that's interesting. It almost seems like a microcosm. This sort of mythology of baseball almost seems almost parallel to that, right? And
it could be, right?
At the end of the day, right? Where facts start and stop and mythology takes over. I don't know. It's a curiosity, and I'm sure it's a conversation for another time about whether the facts matter in this particular case, right? Seemingly much less raw and important, I guess, in the grand scheme of things, right? The origin story of the game of baseball, but still,
absolutely,
it does kind of matter, right? And you wonder, is Spalding is he more of a P.T. Barnum guy and mission accomplished, or is he an American hero, or is it kind of in between, so to speak? And because you wonder, like, is this whole history of baseball, the sport that people have grown up for generations with, is it all sort of predicated on a lie of some sort, right?
And it very well could be, but the bottom line is that people have embraced it for what it is, for what they can see and how they can participate in it. And that's where the line blurs between reality and myth. Is it that important to have that fact, or is it important to believe in something that allows you to feel part of a greater something? It's a good question. And really, the book isn't intended, and I say in the introduction, it's not intended to find the origins of baseball. What it's intended to do is show through the eyes of these superstars that it's more than just the game, that there's a whole business involved in it, but that people playing the game can be part of a greater whole.
No, I find it fascinating. This has been great. I learned a lot through this story, and it's fascinating to me because as we do these kinds of conversations, especially for things way further in the background, right, in history,
Right.
There's a rethinking of these things. You sort of dig into and you challenge your assumptions of things, right? And these origin stories. You talk about the beer and whiskey league and stuff, and the ragtagness of and the shenanigans of the players and all that kind of stuff. I think a lot of people have sort of focused on that, but this transitional period, right, and into what it has become, and now even more so, with all the, now private equity money and sports generally, right? Just the sheer, it's business with a capital B and the entire word in capital letters now, right?
Yep.
And all of that hinges on these very intriguing origin stories that, to your point, a lot of people don't even understand or recognize or frankly care about. And that's a very interesting dynamic that certainly is worth poking holes in. And I think this is a real great contribution to the story, the narrative of this sport that still seems to amaze and impress with its very torturous history and that's other things still to come from it.
Well, that's the beauty of it. There's always going to be something else to find here, and this is just one avenue to take a look at it. And I've been so excited to have been a part of that, but it's only the tip of what's being delved into with this sport and what it means to American culture.
Fascinating stuff. And boy, I have another sort of angle of appreciation and mystification, I guess, around the origin story of baseball. And, Messrs. Wright and Spalding are in the Baseball Hall of Fame for various contributions, but that Doubleday myth and the Mills report for the Mills Commission back in the early 1900s really does throw a wrench into at least what I've thought of as the sanctity and accuracy of the history of the sport of baseball. It's all fascinating stuff, and we kind of just scratched the surface. And the book is a must-read if you're interested in any of this kind of stuff. And even if you don't think you would be, I think you will be. And again, the book is called Selling Baseball: How Superstars George Wright and Albert Spalding Impacted Sports in America. It is published by Rowman and Littlefield, he says, and is, of course, available wherever good books are found, your local bookseller, your independent bookstore, or, of course, if you'd like to support the show, we'd appreciate it if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. All you got to do is search up this episode, number 381. There's a little search bar right there, and you can't miss it. And you'll have not only a synopsis of this show, but also a bunch of convenient links that will link you to the quickest way to get this book via our pals at Amazon, whether that's hardcover or Kindle versions, whatever. And we'll get a couple of shekels of referral love. We appreciate that. That helps keep our lights on. Hey, we don't charge you for this show, so give it a consideration, will you? While you're there, why don't you check out our merch section? Lots of really cool stuff from our pals at oldschoolshirts.com and royalretros.com. Yinzylvania is another one. And we've even got some other garb and stuff to be found at TeePublic, as well as other sponsors to come as the months progress here. So check that out. Always updating that. And again, we get some referral love for those purchases too. And I think you'll find some really cool items that you'll find to help go along with the various treasure trove of content that we pump out for you each and every week. We appreciate that. You can follow us on various socials. On the Twitter X thing, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. On the Blue Sky, you'll find us at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Those are probably our two most active places. You'll find us also on Threads and YouTube. YouTube, I think we're on at Good Seats Still Available. And you'll just search us up. You'll find us out there. You like to send us some email? We love to hear from you. It's hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Our thanks, of course, to Jerry Payne and his audio excellence this week. Thank you, kind sir, as always. A tip of the very musty old 1890s or so baseball cap in your general direction. And again, thank you for listening. We appreciate all of your proverbial cards and letters, and more fun and frivolity coming your way next week. Stay tuned to your feeds, and until then, stay safe and be nice to each other, okay?